Good evening. Welcome to the North Richland Hills City Council work session. It is 5:30 p.m. and I will call the Monday, June 8, 2026 City Council work session to order. A quorum of the City Council is present. The meeting has been duly posted in accordance with Texas Open Meetings Act and the Texas Government Code. Let the record show that Council Member Roberts is absent. Items listed for the discussion on the work session agenda provide an opportunity for the City Council to discuss the items and receive information from the staff. The City Council will not take action on any of the items listed in the discussion during this work session. Any members of the public wishing to address the City Council regarding items listed on the work session agenda may do so during the public comments portion of the regular meeting. Moving to the first item. Council give y'all the opportunity to ask any questions on the items of the regular agenda that the council has not had a clarification on at this time. Does anybody have any questions? Nope. Seeing none, I will move on. Fiscal year 2027 budget background and context. Chase, wherever you are. There you are.
Good afternoon, Council. So as we prepare for in-depth budget and tax rate conversations later this summer, I thought it might be helpful to provide some background and context heading into the fiscal year 27 proposed budget. In this presentation, I'll start with an overview of the city's funds and what each fund can be used for, before providing an overview of tax rate and fund balance changes over the past 3 fiscal years. I will then introduce a long-term financial forecast that staff have developed for the general fund before concluding with a discussion on next steps in the budget process. So the city's funds fall into 2 categories: operating, which are addressed in the annual operating budget, and capital funds, which are addressed in the capital budget. City has 23 operating funds, of which 4 of those are internal service funds. In other words, those are funds that provide services to other funds within the organization. Those internal service funds are facilities, fleet and information technology, and self-insurance. Operating funds are budgeted for a period of 1 year and must be balanced for adoption, meaning that revenues are equal to expenditures. City also has 16 capital funds, which are organized into 9 different categories of projects. Given the large and complex nature of these projects, they often stretch beyond a 1-year time period. Therefore, these budgets do not expire annually. Capital budgets are funded through a mix of funding from outside agencies, cash reserves, transfers from operating funds, and debt issuance. This slide provides a breakdown of the 9 different categories of projects within the capital budget and the funding within each category in the adopted fiscal year 2026 budget. You can see that over $133 million worth of previously approved capital projects retained their authorization to proceed, while an additional $18 million in new funding was included across these categories. This slide provides information on the relative size of all of our operating funds, with the exception of the 9 special revenue funds, which are bundled together for the purposes of this graphic. City's largest funds are the General Fund, Utility Fund, Debt Service Fund, Parks Fund, and CCD Fund. While I will not walk individually through each fund in the city, I did want to cover a few, starting with the General Fund. The General Fund is the largest, most flexible fund of the city and includes funding for most city departments. Property tax, sales tax, and franchise fees make up the largest revenue sources, which support public safety, community development, public works, culture and recreation functions, which include our library, and general government. Next is the Debt Service Fund, which is used for annual debt payments. This fund is predominantly funded through the I&S portion of the property tax rate, with some additional revenue transferred in from other funds for self-supporting debt. In other words, debt from funds like the drainage utility, which do not require support from the tax rate to cover long-term infrastructure investment expenses. The next fund I'll cover is the Parks Fund, which accounts for the 1/2 cent sales tax adopted by voters in 1992. This fund also accounts for NRH Center activities, with approximately 30% of the fund's revenue coming from the NRH Center. Major expenditures within Parks Fund are capital project investments, NRH Center operations, and parks and public grounds maintenance. Next is the Crime Control and Prevention District Fund, also known as the CCD Fund. This fund accounts for the half-cent sales tax adopted by voters in 1996 and reauthorized twice since that time. This fund is exclusively used for crime prevention and control and derives most of its revenue from sales tax, with approximately 13% of revenue coming from a cost-sharing agreement with BISD for NRH school resource officers and campus officers. Major expenditures include uniform patrol, community resources, and investigations. The city's utility fund, as the name implies, accounts for water and sewer utility revenues and expenses. The utility fund is an enterprise fund, meaning it functions as a self-contained business. Water and sewer charges make up the majority of the fund's revenue, while water and sewer treatment agreements with the Trinity River Authority and the City of Fort Worth make up the majority of expenditures. The Aquatic Park Fund accounts for NRH2O revenues and expenses, and this fund also functions as an enterprise fund. Admissions, food, and merchandise sales make up the majority of revenues, while maintenance and other park operations make up the majority of expenditures. The final fund I will go over individually is the Golf Fund, which accounts for Iron Horse Golf Course revenues and expenditures. Despite being operated by a private management company, the golf course is a part of the city's annual budgeting process. Green fees and food and beverage sales make up the majority of revenue, while maintenance and other course operations make up the majority of expenditures. Earlier in my presentation, I indicated that all 9 of the city's special revenue funds make up a combined 4% of the city's overall budget. This slide provides additional information regarding what those funds are and how they are used. Typically, these small funds have a legally constrained revenue source that can only be used for a very specific purpose, hence the need to treat them as their own separate funds. Because none of these funds rely on property tax revenue, staff will present the fiscal year 2027 proposed budget for these funds before all of the others. I will share more information on timing at the end of this presentation. Final portion of my overview of the city's funds touches on the internal service funds. I previously mentioned that these funds serve the other funds and operations within the city and are organized into the Self-Insurance Fund, Information Technology Fund, Fleet Services Fund, and the Facilities Fund. Dollar amounts for these funds are often excluded from the grand total of the city's expenditures to avoid double counting, since the funding for these funds is shown as expenditures within other funds. For example, the General Fund, which pays for a portion of each of these services. I'll now provide some history and context regarding the city's property tax rate. In fiscal year 2023, the city adopted a property tax rate equal to the voter approval rate. Since that time, for 3 years straight, the city has adopted a rate at or below the no new revenue rate. For comparison, this slide shows every incorporated city and town in both Dallas and Tarrant counties. Of these 72 entities, only 9 adopted a tax rate at or below the no new revenue rate for the current fiscal year. When we look at how many entities have adopted at or below the no new revenue rate for 3 years straight, the number shrinks to 3. Cities of Grapevine, Keller, and North Richland Hills. We have been able to sustain this tax rate in part by the use of reserves. This slide shows how the total fund balance for all of the city's operating funds has changed since fiscal year 2023. While each operating fund has limitations on what revenue can be spent on, consolidating everything together like this can be helpful for tracking how that total balance has changed over time. Compared to when we started here in fiscal year 2023, the total balance went up slightly in fiscal years 24 and 25, before decreasing slightly for the current fiscal year based on projections. Fiscal year 2027 is missing from this slide as we're still working to develop the proposed operating budget, but staff are not currently anticipating any major changes to operating fund balance levels. The takeaway from this slide is that the city's operating funds have been relatively stable over the past 3 fiscal years. In comparison, the total fund balance available within the city's capital funds has decreased from year to year. In comparison to fiscal year 2023, we anticipate ending the current fiscal year with about half those available resources. The current draft of the fiscal year 2027 capital budget, which I will share more information on in the next presentation, is expected to use additional fund balance from capital funds, spending down these resources further. I do want to emphasize here that converting available fund balance within capital funds into real-world improvements like better streets, drainage, and drinking water infrastructure is a good thing and is ultimately what these dollars were intended for. The intent of this information is to show, in part, how the city has been able to sustain capital project investments without issuing new debt. The final item to share with you tonight is a long-term forecast staff have developed for the general fund. To achieve City Council's goal of stewarding the public's money well, we need to adopt a multi-year planning perspective to better manage the trajectory of the city's financial position. To that end, we have created a 5-year forecast for the general fund based on similar methodologies employed by peer cities. The methodology starts with a baseline forecast based on existing service levels and a no new revenue tax rate, then adds to that baseline service enhancements, anticipated cost increases, and potential revenue enhancements. I'll start by walking you through the baseline forecast. Existing service levels at the no new revenue rate. In the first column are categories of expenses and revenues within the general fund's budget. In the second column are fiscal year 2026 figures from the adopted budget. In the third column are forecasted expenditure and revenue figures for the upcoming 2027 fiscal year based on the assumptions that are laid out in the fourth and final column. This forecast assumes salaries and benefits will change in the future based on historical annual merit increase levels, and that all other expenditures will increase based on predicted inflation levels from the Federal Reserve, and that one-time expenditures in the current year's budget are removed. For revenues, assumptions include some additional property tax revenue from new construction activity, sales tax revenue growth that is 0.5% higher than inflation, and the elimination of one-time revenues from fiscal year 2026. Based on all of these assumptions, and before looking at potential cost increases or service adjustments, we would expect a budget surplus of $655,000 heading into next fiscal year. However, when we use these same assumptions, but carry the analysis out through fiscal year 2031, the outlook does change. Starting in fiscal year 2029, we would not expect baseline revenues to keep up with baseline expenditures. Our forecast to the general fund also includes changes to the baseline assumptions, starting with the possibility of keeping annual street maintenance expenses above the $1 million per year standard amount. For fiscal year 2027, staff are planning to recommend a total of $4 million for street maintenance, which would match the current year's budget. However, the general fund would only need to be responsible for a portion of this, with $1 million available within the street capital fund to bridge that gap. Starting in fiscal year 28, the general fund would need to fully absorb any additional street maintenance expenditures beyond the $1 million annual amount. Healthcare cost increases are not projected for next fiscal year, but are starting in 28. For fleet sustainability, the recently completed fleet efficiency study indicated that the general fund is contributing approximately $2 million less per year than would be needed to maintain appropriate vehicle replacement timeframes. And we recommend correcting this, or the study recommended correcting this. This forecast assumes we would start implementing this recommendation in 2028 with sustainable funding levels fully implemented by 2031. Finally, the city's existing contract with Trinity Metro TexRail includes a built-in cost increase of 5% each year until 2035, at which point the annual amount switches to 3/8 of 1 cent of our sales tax revenue. For the purposes of modeling, we've also calculated the impact of potential revenue enhancements, specifically through adopting a tax rate at the voter approval rate instead of the no new revenue rate. For fiscal year 27, that would represent an additional $1 million plus in revenue. Carrying this analysis out through fiscal year 2031 shows potential increased costs of just under $7 million with potential additional revenue of over $5 million. Putting all of this together produces the 5-year forecast shown on this slide. Assuming baseline expenditures, baseline revenues, increased street maintenance funding, and contractually mandated increases from Trinity Metro TexRail, staff are currently working hard to close a potential budget deficit for next fiscal year of over $1.4 million. While we do believe we can get there, this analysis shows that this challenge is only going to grow over time. For the purpose of this slide, this forecast does not include any additional property tax revenue beyond the no new revenue rate. Staff are currently working to develop next year's budget, a process that started last November. Currently, city management are reviewing budget submissions from departments with a continued emphasis on controlling costs and finding efficiencies. At the next council meeting on June 22nd, staff will present an early look at the fiscal year 27 proposed budget, starting with the city's special revenue funds. Certified property tax values are due from the Tarrant County Appraisal District on Saturday, July 25th, which staff will use to calculate next fiscal year's no new revenue and voter approval tax rates. The proposed fiscal year 27 budget will be submitted to City Council on Monday, July 27th, followed by a special work session on Friday, July 31st at the NRH Center's Grand Hall. Concludes my presentation. Happy to answer any questions.
Anybody have any questions? Kelvin, you made some notes.
Let me make some just clarifying comments. So again, when we're looking at these forecasts, like Chase covered, it's based on assumptions that we're going to continue to do what we've been doing. So, and it doesn't incorporate, because we don't have a crystal ball, what changes we might make or we might recommend to the City Council to make in terms of different levels of expenses that we can control. So, so there's that. But you all had asked us to begin to look at some long-term forecasts and present those to you, and so we've done that. The other thing to remember is that we, of course, don't have our final certified values yet, and we won't until July 25th. So everything we're looking at for the proposed budget is based on using, I believe, the current rate when we're looking at revenues. But again, we don't know where our values will end, but we estimate that they will be lower than what our current certified values are. So what does that do? That increases your no new revenue rate and your voter approval rate based on the truth and taxation calculations. So again, we are in the very preliminary stages of putting together the proposed budget, but we are looking at some of the recommendations you'll see when we finalize it will include pulling some of those levers and expenses that are in our control to pull. Whether we do that or not is wholly and completely up to each of you. And I'm not prepared to go into any detail of what those might be because we're still fleshing that out. But one thing too, I know you can see the numbers, but the general fund revenue, we've always talked about that property tax doesn't even completely fund all of our public safety expenses. And when we're talking about that public safety category, it's police and fire. So you saw that, our revenues from property and sales tax total 66% of the general fund revenues. And our public safety expenses are 60.5% of general fund expenses. And so the reason I'm bringing that up is as we continue to face the continued pressures by state legislative changes related to property tax, it's important to remember that really property tax and sales tax together fund public safety. All of our other city services are really funded through other things, either franchise fees, service charges, grants, that kind of thing. So anything else that comes out of the general fund is really funded through other sources. So when you begin to talk about eliminating the property tax, you begin to talk about some serious cuts or some alternate plan that would fund the largest portion of our general fund budget. So that's just, some things to think about as we go into this proposed budget year.
Hey, can you go back to the one slide that showed the different cities in the breakout, please? I think that's a great slide right there. I know we've done a fantastic job over the last few years, but I think this is very telling. This is all of DFW, and we've got 3 cities on there. Grapevine's probably an outlier just with the airport and all their revenue they get from that, as well as their tourism and everything else. So I really like that. I do like the fact, Chase, and the rest of the group that's done that multi-year planning. I'm looking forward to seeing that next year, or next week, or next meeting, I should say. But yeah, this is going to be a tough year. We've got inflation. Everybody's sitting at, personally, just the cost of, gas, everything else that's out there. Public safety, costs are increasing. We're being hamstrung by the state legislature, it seems like, every time we turn around with some type of new non-funded mandates that are out there. So, health costs, everything else. So I'm looking forward to, not necessarily the actual numbers, but, I am looking forward to seeing that. I'm glad that y'all are being proactive and looking at that long-term view.
Appreciate that.
I think to Kelvin's point, we're facing headwinds that are outside of our control. I think the business personal property tax exemption, which is why we formed the Legislative Affairs Council, is to push back on some of this so that we can maintain more of the control. I think you're right. When you look up there, you see 3 cities that for 3 years have been there, only 3 cities, and that's before these headwinds have come in. It's pretty remarkable. So thank y'all for all the hard work you're doing, and it'll be a tough row to hoe, as we used to say, right?
Mm-hmm. Anybody else? So a couple things. As the auditors have pointed out, each of the last 3 years that I've watched is telling us that we should be spending down our reserves. So following that path, that's as much as why we were there as anything. I've said this before, I look at excessive reserves as overtaxing of prior years. So we're getting that money back to where it belongs, especially for the roads. Believing and showing what you did on the graph that we're going to have no one-time cost, that you don't know about. That's obviously not going to happen. So even with the amount that you were over, I'm looking at at least $2 million under, just right off the bat, in terms of just one-time costs that could come in play. Couple questions. One is, when you look at, because fund accounting does confuse me occasionally, or more than occasionally, but when you look at like the self-insurance fund, and I know that's pretty well funded because there's pretty good interest returns that come into that keep the account down, which is what you should absolutely have in order to do that. And we all know insurance costs, health insurance costs are going up. Do employee contributions fund that account as well as other the city's contributions as well?
Yep. Yes. Yeah. So the city, with most employers, shares the cost of health insurance. Approximately 80% is funded by the city. So that would be payments from other funds. 20% by employees. You know, the fact that we're not projecting higher cost increases to the city in our forecast here is not because healthcare costs aren't increasing. They are. But that is not, in turn, turning into an increased payment from other city funds for fiscal year '27, in part because of those interest earnings and that healthy fund balance. But based on our calculations, we do think we'll probably hit a tipping point as soon as fiscal year '28, where the city and employees may be expected at that point to contribute a little bit more in order to keep that fund in a healthy position.
Okay. And do you, have they given you your trends for next year for what you believe health insurance is going to be?
Yes,
What
we're
are they
having-
saying the increases are? Medical and drugs, if they give them to you separate or combined?
So what we're seeing right now in our health insurance cost is particularly for prescription drugs. That is where we're seeing significant increase. So we have implemented a few programs based on our claims experience to help to mitigate some of those costs. For example, cooking classes that have to deal with diabetes mitigation and other things that we're bringing additional services to our employees. We also are considering partnerships with local healthcare providers, which we'll get into more when we move forward with the full budget proposal, to help people with some of those preventative appointments. We understand building that bridge, particularly for people who don't have a relationship with a healthcare provider, is something that we can support, something we can assist with, especially if they're close to where people work, so they don't have to go find that on their own. There is some ability to negotiate with local care providers in that case, especially because they already accept our insurance provider and because we're self-insured. So we do have some levers within
Little
our
control,
plans
yeah.
where we're able to leverage some relationships in order to reduce some of our costs.
But that is the beauty of having an ERISA self-insured plan.
Yes.
You do get to do that a lot, which is great, so, okay, good.
Yeah, and that's another part of our strategy. So, you know, how are we able to keep things steady for employees and for our city funds heading into next fiscal year is a combination of the interest earnings and some of those levers that Trudy mentioned from a plan design perspective that we can pull.
Obviously, July 31st is going to be a very important meeting. We're going to hear a lot. I mean, the cost savings is going to be there for some things. Obviously, using the term headwinds is a big deal because there are some things. And I'll say I think we're in a good place overall. Addressing it now before it gets worse is a good thing. You know, and I want to keep in mind for everybody, you know, this is, I think, why it's extremely important to get the bond passed. It's going to be in November that we're going to be presented next meeting, right? Next meeting, yeah, at the next meeting to move forward with that because I think it takes pressure off of our street maintenance budget as well at the same time. So we could probably alleviate some of that spending in the current versus, you know, hoping that a lot of that gets covered, you know, or people are feeling the change from the bond money being spent that we don't have right now anymore. So, well, thank you. Any other questions?
But before we switch to the capital budget and the long-term debt, which is actually kind of in preparation for what you're going to hear next meeting from the bond committee, we, you know, have really, I'm excited to present, you know, and excited to see where it ends up. Again, we're still in the beginning of our proposed budget journey, but what I'm already hearing from department heads is they have really taken the efficiency training and process improvement training that we've all been through to heart. And they have really taken a hard look at their operations. And so I'm pleased to see that even though it may not generate cost savings, some of the things that they're proposing make it where we're going to be able to maybe do more within existing budget amounts. And so they also presented this year, everybody was required to present potential sunset items, and so those have been interesting to look at. So I just need you to know that we are also taking a look at efficiency in this, and and that has been taken to heart. Again, also our efficiency studies showed, you know, there's really not waste in the city. If anything, we operate a little too lean. So that doesn't mean that we're going to come in and ask for a lot more money. We know we're not in a position to do that. So we're taking those efficiency recommendations and trying to do more within the constraints that we have, so.
Thank you. And you get to stay there for the fiscal year 2027 capital projects and long-term debt management strategy.
I did try to talk Craig into delivering this presentation, and he declined. So instead, Trudy is going to join me for part of this. So for this presentation, we're going to be presenting proposed projects for next fiscal year while also providing an overview of the city's debt management strategy. So I'm going to kick things off by presenting the fiscal year 27 proposed capital projects, including how we typically fund projects as a city, as well as cover a brief history of investments over the past 5 years. Trudy's then going to step in to cover the city's long-term debt management strategy, which will include an overview of our long-term capital plans, debt capacity, and specific recommendations for fiscal year 2027. So to start, when staff are considering how to fund a needed capital project, we first look to leverage any available external funding, typically in the form of grants. If external funding isn't available or isn't sufficient to complete a project, we'll look to apply existing cash reserves or transfer available funding for operating funds, including the general fund where appropriate. If additional funding is still needed, as a last resort, City will look to issue debt for projects or delay projects altogether. Over the past 5 fiscal years, including budget revisions, the city has invested between $19 and $35 million into capital projects annually. You can see that over time, the amount of debt funding that has been appropriated has decreased, while the amount of funding from reserves and transfers has increased. In terms of what those funds have been used for, the largest categories of expenditures include streets and sidewalks, water and sewer utility projects, and major capital equipment, which includes both IT and fleet replacement projects. For fiscal year 2027, staff are planning to recommend a total of 5 street and sidewalk projects totaling $5.6 million. Wendell Court South is a complete reconstruction of a court funded primarily through $515,000 in matching CDBG funds, with the city only contributing $18,000. The sidewalk rehabilitation and preventative street maintenance programs are maintaining their fiscal year 2026 investment levels at $100,000 and $4 million, respectively. While 2 intersections have been selected on Boulevard 26 for traffic signal improvements at $500,000 each. Outside of the CDBG project, the remainder are funded through reserves and operational transfers. Staff are planning to recommend 1 drainage project, $523,000 for the Street Drainage Improvement Program. This program addresses standing water requests received by Public Works each year and is expected to fully resolve approximately 63 outstanding requests. 5 water and sewer utility projects are being considered for fiscal year 27, all funded through reserves or operational transfers. The AC water line replacement program will introduce a process to begin replacing water distribution lines that are reaching the end of their useful lives. $430,000 is needed to begin design and engineering work for the eventual replacement of the Johnson Ground Storage Reservoir, which was installed in 1983. Funding is also being contemplated for replacement of a broken water line beneath the railroad crossing on Holiday Lane, as well as for design and engineering work for the replacement or rehabilitation of the Watauga and Stanley Keller pump stations. Park and recreation projects that staff are planning to recommend include playground replacements, LED lighting upgrades, creation of redevelopment plans for Richfield Park, and replacement of the boulevard at the Adventure World Playground. Also being considered for fiscal year 27 are replacements of drainage infrastructure in the dock at Green Valley Pond, court resurfacing at the Richland Tennis Center, with BISD contributing $25,000 in matching funds, and replastering the pool at the NRH Center. Staff are also considering recommending the addition of $3.5 million of funding for construction for the renovation of the kiddie area at the NRH2O Family Water Park. Design work was funded in fiscal year '24, with construction set to begin in the fall of 2028 if approved. The project would be funded through reserves and operational transfers. One facilities project is being considered for '27 to replace the landscape uplighting around City Hall, a portion of which is currently broken or inoperable. New fixtures would be more resilient and energy efficient. Finally, the major capital projects category includes two different types of projects, IT and fleet. For IT projects, new mobile computers and wireless connectivity upgrades are needed for the city's public safety vehicles. These projects would both be funded through reserves and operational transfers. For the fleet side of things, a total of 14 projects are being considered, all for replacements of existing equipment, meaning that no fleet additions beyond what currently exists are being planned. Replacements include 1 ambulance, 1 fire aerial truck, 7 police interceptors, and more that are listed here. The remainder of the proposed replacement list can be found on this slide. Staff believe that all replacements can be funded through existing reserves and operational transfers, with the exception of the ambulance and fire truck, for which staff are recommending issuance of CO debt. I will now turn it over to Trudy to provide an overview of how that recommendation plays into the city's overall debt management strategy.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Chase, one of your first slides for this, for the capital projects presentation you just did.
Yep.
Did I read it right that we've received $0 in outside funding for fiscal year 2026?
So for '26, that may be accurate. I would have to go back and check. It might just be really small. The reason it's so large in '22, '23, '24, which is not really the historic norm, although it might look like it there, is because of ARPA funding that came from the federal government. Large tranches of that funding came all at once. Council appropriated that funding over a few fiscal years, and that has now been exhausted.
So 2025 would be more reflective of something we could consider a general amount, and 2022 to 2024 are just really odd outliers because of ARPA.
That would be a fair characterization.
Okay,
yes.
thank you.
In '26, we'll have the CDBG funding at some point, right? Or
Yes.
what is it? Some court.
Well, for '27, yes.
Yeah, that'll be in '27. Okay. that's
Correct,
Okay.
correct. Yep.
Kelvin?
Okay.
Hey Chase, a couple things just real quick before, sorry Trudy. So on the drainage projects, can you go back to that real quick? What was that? Is it a particular place or what type of drainage?
Yeah, so these are needs that are identified as they're reported to Public Works. So if residents call in or identify standing water on our streets,
Okay.
Public Works keeps a log of those projects as they come in. And this amount of funding, what did I say, 60-some projects, this would be able to address.
Okay.
So standing water issues identified by residents.
Okay. And with our recent flood incident, I mean, obviously that's outside of this, but I guess, have we identified any areas potentially for future based off of that flood a couple of?
Not yet, no. I
Okay.
mean, but, you know, going back to, for those of y'all that remember, the summer of 2007, when 820 went underwater, that revealed to us some distinct drainage project needs. To my knowledge, and I'll have to get with Nathan, I don't know that we heard of anything outside of those issues we're already aware of
Okay.
with the most recent rain events.
Okay, great, thanks. And then how old's the boardwalk on, at Adventure World? Wow. Okay.
2014.
Okay, in the kiddie area that's not Professor Progenstein, right? That's the separate part, right? Okay, very good. Thanks.
I have one question on the replacement of various trailers and vehicles and stuff. Is there, assuming there's some residual value that we get on selling current stuff, is it factored in there, or is it? It is.
Well, so it's not factored into the replacement cost.
Right.
What it is factored into is our funding strategy.
Got it,
Right,
yeah.
for how are we going to come up with the funds for these, absolutely. Okay. And now Trudy.
Mayor and Council, this will not be the only time that you see the capital budget information. The point here really was to talk about funding sources and what we are anticipating, because that really sets the stage for what we're looking in terms of long-term, not just the single fiscal year. And also for the CDBG funding, we don't receive that as a payment to us. The county administers CDBG funds. We are providing to them a small match amount, and then the county is handling the project. So probably going back to your question about outside funding and so on and so forth, because it's not money we're receiving inside of the city, it's not going to show up in our financials as revenue or expenditures that we have directly. We're not hiring the contractors to do the work, but we are being able to see that benefit back to the community. So the value of the project will be over $500,000. Our actual expenses will be around $18,000. Okay. So again, as Chase mentioned earlier, we do utilize 4 different strategies for handling our overall debt management as a municipality. The first thing is when we have long-term capital projects, we look to leverage to the extent that we can outside dollars. That may be that we're partnering with the county in order to do a street repair project and so on and so forth. For the last 5 years, about 7% of our capital projects have come as part of these outside resources. We also utilize existing cash wherever we can, sort of the pay-as-you-go model. I've been in this industry long enough to say I remember when each year we could actually go up 8% in our total expenses. I know it seems like so much now compared to where we are these days, but that really made a lot of flexibility in being able to cash fund projects. That's not today, but in yesteryear, we certainly could do that. But we are finding ourselves funding about 50% of our capital projects for the last 5 years just from utilizing cash reserves. We also look to utilize all of our restricted funds that are able to have their own dedicated revenue and that can handle debt to do so. So we actually, in addition to our general debt service fund, we have 6 other funds that are paying their own debt in order to maintain the facilities that they are responsible for. And we also operate within the city's capacity. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation, but what that really means is that when we are setting any of our debt schedules, anytime we're going out to issue debt, we have next year's payment a little less than this year's payment. And the difference between this year's payment and next year's payment is what we call capacity, because it's a dollar amount that we're going to save in that next year that we could leverage if the city needed to in order to handle ongoing projects. Not only have we done a 10-year look ahead for operational expenses in the general fund, we've done the same for our capital funds. We do this every year. This is actually not new for us as an organization. It is included in the annual adopted capital improvement project overall, our overall book for that. But we wanted to be sure to bring a conversation forward with council so that you all are taking a look at how our needs are over time. So for fiscal year 27, we're not officially proposing the budget tonight, but we have taken a look at what the capital needs are. You can see by category what the amounts are that we are anticipating. So for next fiscal year, we're looking at about $20 million in total needs to happen, but look what happens in 28. We've got some large-scale utility projects that we really need to take a look at. We've also got some major capital equipment that we need to take a look at as well. We find ourselves, as long as we're pretty close to about 20 million in a given year, we typically can cash fund those projects through operating transfers. We can do some of that with our reserves. We've certainly seen our cash on hand go to work and create ample interest earnings for us. But once we find ourselves in peak years where the needs of that year in order to handle projects is going to be beyond about that 20 million, we do find ourselves needing to ask, how are we going to come up with that difference? One thing I want to point out here is this is not including anything that would be considered for a general obligation bond or something we're asking citizens to consider. So under the street and sidewalk section, for example, that's our preventative street maintenance. That's not rehabilitation and full-blown reconstruction of roadways. This is looking at those annual operating costs, sort of that annual pothole filling and repairing sidewalks and going in to do slurry seals and all kinds of things for our streets. That's what is represented in the blue area. Our council has been dedicated, as you know, to conserving our property tax rate. Since the year 2020, our rate has gone down by 13%. The city does offer a senior and disabled exemption of $36,000, and in addition to that, there's also a ceiling or freeze amount that also goes into effect for those residents. In fiscal year 23, the City Council adopted the voter approval rate, but also that year adopted a homestead exemption at the highest amount allowed by the state. So that year, even though we were at the VAR, we also increased the exemptions that extend over to our homesteaded properties. In fiscal year 24, City Council adopted the no new revenue rate, and in fiscal years 25 and 26, the property tax rate was below the no new revenue rate. We're going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about different types of debt instruments. Spoiler alert, we are going to recommend a debt issuance, so we're providing this information for you all to have the appropriate context. The first one we'll discuss is a certificate of obligation, also known as a CO. This is a type of bond that is issued by municipalities, but also state and local governments to finance public infrastructure projects and other capital needs. This gives you more information about what differentiates a CO from other types of debt. The first thing is that it's approved by the City Council. Voter approval is not required unless 5% of qualified voters petition for an election. It is backed by the issuer's taxing authority or other revenues. So we could issue a CO, for example, that is paid for by one of our restricted funds. It isn't always paid for by the property tax rate. So it could be from utility fees, park fees, sales tax, etc. This is broadly similar to bonds that could be issued through a general obligation bond, but they're often smaller in dollar amount. They tend to be faster response for routine sorts of needs. Replacement of a water line, for example, is something we generally consider to be a routine need. We can also use that for emergency circumstances, regulatory compliance, or to seize favorable financing conditions. Years ago, when you could issue debt for around 1%, it was pretty advantageous to do so. So there are times when cities may do that because of favorable conditions. In terms of the issuance process, it does require adoption of an intent resolution as well as public notices. It is about a 45 to 60-day process, so it is not something that happens in a single council meeting, but it is issued by the governing body. This gives you all an overview of the City of North Richland Hills' most recent certificate of obligation issuances. So a few years ago, we issued $5.4 million in order to replace the Green Extreme. That is paid for by the aquatic park. So the aquatic park is covering all of the debt associated with that replacement. But we also have issued debt for preventative street maintenance, for replacement of large-scale vehicles, for infrastructure, for our IT system, and also for facility maintenance and repairs. And those items don't have their own dedicated restricted resource in terms of revenue, so those are paid for by our INS rate. So issuance of these types of debts are the things that we see occurring now within our debt schedules in the INS. General obligation bonds are also a type of debt that are issued by municipal governments, also state and local governments, to finance public infrastructure. These are backed by the ad valorem tax power. So the issuer or the city pledges to use its full taxing authority, which would be property taxes, to repay principal and interest. This is what we call the full faith and credit pledge. So the governing body can issue taxes sufficient to cover these bond payments. It does require voter approval because it relies on tax revenue, and because of the dollar amount, it is something that would be approved by voters in a public referendum. This ensures that taxpayers that they consent to the increased obligation for the payment associated with the issuance of this debt. City Council, this is an overview of the GO bonds that have been brought forward and presented to the citizens since 1985. We presented this information to CPAC. We also wanted to be sure that you all were aware of this information as well. So you can see the election date in 2003. We had several propositions that were all presented to voters at the same time. The next column shows the dollar amount, the purpose of that particular proposition, and the election results. Since 1985, voters have approved 9 out of 10 bond propositions. And so you'll note here that street improvements certainly are a consistent item that we bring forward to the residents. This chart provides a quick overview to do a comparison of GOs versus COs. So in terms of voter approval, GOs do require that a public election to be held, and COs do not. They are approved by the City Council. GOs are best used for large visible projects, new buildings, roads, parks, those sort of things, and COs are typically used for urgent or essential infrastructure, things that you would say are a little harder for people to sort of see, utilities, roofs, heavy equipment, those kinds of things. In terms of timeline, GOs certainly are extensive. It can take quite a bit of time, months, possibly years, because of the election process. COs are typically around the 45 to 60-day timeline because of the notice of intent, getting on City Council agendas, posting in the newspaper, public notices on websites, etc. In terms of transparency, certainly GOs have an incredibly high transparency threshold to meet because of the election process. And for COs, they do require public notice, intent to use, etc. So I would call that more medium because it is subject to open public forum. For the dollar amount, GOs are going to be your higher dollar amounts that you're looking to issue because they would be paid back over a long-term period of time. We're typically talking 20 or more years for a GO. For COs, those would be smaller amounts and also shorter term debt. Tax rate impact for GOs, that is coming directly from the property tax rate, the INS portion of the tax rate. For COs, that could be either self-supporting or on the property tax rate. So it depends on the purpose of the funds as to how they would be repaid. So when we look at the projects that are currently being discussed for our longer term plans for capital projects, we'll start with our self-supporting capital needs. So all of these are coming from funds for needs for projects where these funds have their own revenue. They've got dedicated revenues that are restricted for their use. And we see that over time, there is a difference when you look per year and what those dollar amounts are. We've highlighted a couple of areas where the dollar amounts are getting to be higher than we would typically be able to just cash fund. So we see the utility fund, for example, in fiscal 28, also in 2030 and fiscal 2033. We see some larger amounts for the aquatic park in fiscal 2033, also for the parks fund. It's possible that some of these could be cash funded. But again, when we're getting at these larger dollar amounts and you combine them all into one fiscal year, it may be difficult for those to be completely cash funded. We're not making recommendations right now about future years' expenses. We just want to make sure that council is aware that we do have our sights set, not just for fiscal 27, but the longer term as well. If debt were to be issued to cover any of these projects, it would not be repaid from property taxes. We would utilize the restricted funds within these designated areas in order to carry the cost of those projects. But we do have some needs that are for things that don't have their own dedicated revenue, and those would be the non-self-supporting capital needs. And when you look over time here, our fleet area in particular, to some extent IT, maybe street preventative maintenance, finds itself at a dollar cost in any given year that could exceed our ability to simply cash fund those expenses. Again, these departments, these functional areas of the city don't have independent dedicated revenue, and as a result, if there was any debt to be issued, and that's an if, that would have to be repaid from property taxes. This is a chart that we typically show City Council when we're going through the budget proposal process, and at first blush, It says quite a bit, but we're going to walk through what it's saying here. The lighter area of the chart, that's really just that straight line across, is assuming that the payment that we're making in fiscal year 26, the dollar amount that we're paying this year, if that dollar amount were to remain the same through our entire existing debt schedule, and we paid the same dollar amount, then that light area shows us how much we could make in additional payments. The darker area shows us, based on our current debt schedule, what we'd actually pay per year. The difference between the darker area, our actual payments, and the lighter line at the very top is what we call our capacity. That area represents, or that delta in between is representing what is the difference between what we have to pay today versus what we could be paying tomorrow. If we kept the same payment, how much more could we leverage in order to take care of longer-term capital needs? When we look at our total for fiscal year 26, what we're paying off the INS rate from property taxes for debt versus what we are scheduled to pay in fiscal 27, if no changes are made, that is a reduction of $786,000. Depending on where we are in terms of our total assessed values, that is about 1 penny on the tax rate. Does that make sense? So if we do nothing, our INS rate would drop by about a penny on the debt side of the house. Once we lose that capacity, it's gone forever. There's no look back. Now we're resetting that bar at a penny less than it is this year. But we know our needs as an organization are not falling, certainly not next year, and certainly when we do that longer term look over the next 10 or so years. For fiscal year 27, right now, we are looking at about $20 million in capital projects for the next fiscal year. One of the things that we did when we went through our fleet efficiency study was to have a look at our replacement schedule and also our cost allocations. We've talked with departments internally to vet that, to ensure that we are holding on to vehicles as long as we need to, but not so long that we get to the point where the cost of maintenance, the cost that we would get for selling them, does not put us in a position where the city is really at a loss. Based on the study, those recommendations, and internal review, we find that these really large-scale replacements for fire, ambulances, and also for engines. This $2.5 million listed here for an engine, this is actually a Quint. It's a larger scale piece of equipment. It's not just a regular fire engine. Regular engines aren't at the $2.5 amount, but because this is a more dynamic piece of equipment that can do all kinds of fun things, it does come at a slightly higher amount. But this is not expanding our fleet. This is just maintaining our existing schedules and maintaining our existing equipment. So this is just trading in like for what we already have utilized. Staff is recommending that we look at issuing debt next year for this equipment because our overall fleet allocation study shows that we can sustain cash funding most fleet. But when we get into these really high dollar amounts, which are not every year, we're not replacing to this cost every single year. But when we get to this point, it is not something we can simply cash fund. One thing I want to make sure that council is aware of too is when we look at the impact of the compression of our tax rate. So again, we see here shown that darker area again is our existing debt schedule and what it is that we're set to pay. And sort of the bridge that we're trying to build between fiscal year and fiscal 27 is to maintain our existing payment. Just on a cash basis, it's the same amount that we'd be paying from one year to the next. By issuing some debt, small amount, again, out of $20 million, we're asking it to issue about $3 million. That would allow us to maintain our existing INS rate. This will impact where our tax rate will be by the time a GO election is presented to council, if you all agree and want to provide that to the citizens, and if the citizens were to approve it, this will be an impact for fiscal year 28. So even though we would be proposing a bond election in November of 26, the 27 budget would already be adopted. So this would actually impact us starting in fiscal year 28. And you'll notice with no changes, we'll continue to see a decline in our overall payments, which also means that we're continuing to compress our tax rate on the INS side of the house. So at that 1 penny difference, if we don't issue any debt next year, we're now a penny less in terms of our overall rate, which means any changes to our debt schedules, we've lost that penny, and now the bond election would be impacted even more so by the consideration of the voters of North Richland Hills. It's a lot of information. With that, I'll take any questions.
So
you
going
have.
back 4 or 5 slides to the losing the 1 penny. Yeah, there you go, right there. And that's only been the last couple of years, right?
That we've not issued debt?
No, that the law changed to where we lose the penny as it goes along to use capacity.
So the state legislature did pass a statute that we could only include in our adopted INS rate the minimum amount for debt payments for the next year. So we couldn't simply pay extra based on existing cash reserves and other things and include that in our INS rate. That is, we would automatically have a lower rate if we did not issue any additional debt.
Right. So this is important to understand, and I'll just say, Russ, I think you helped with some signs for the Birdville bond that said they saved how much money? What did it say? 60, 70, yeah, something. So what we did while we were in the Birdville board, we kept that extra penny. We'll just use it from a reference point for a couple of years, and paid down the expensive debt that saved all that money. So the legislature now has changed it where you actually can't pay debt early because that would actually even double penalize you the next year after you did it because you would move the penny down plus whatever you paid down and you wouldn't need it anymore, so it'd even bring it down again. Now, if we were a city that had a very irresponsible budget up to that point, you actually come out better in the process because you would have been keeping your capacity even higher than what you had because you'd be spreading those payments out even farther and you would have actually had more debt. But the fact being, what I would classify as over the many years that North Richland Hill's been here, been quite prudent with money. So we're very thin in all of that. So keeping the idea that you're and this is kind of the inside baseball, is allowing more debt right now through these COs keeps our capacity up in order to keep us to be able to have the capacity later to continue to pay down more. I know that that makes little sense whatsoever, but so does the law, because the law was really focused on the larger cities that have been a little irresponsible in attempt to try to squeeze them and compress their rate as it goes down so you can keep that going. So I'm just adding a little color commentary to what Trudy just gave us to know that that's why we want to do that, because it really is, and I'm such an anti-debt person. This is hard for these words to come out of my mouth. It's actually better for the city and management of our money from a cash perspective to do that now to keep that capacity up to when you don't need it, and you'll be able to have some room to leverage some strategy outside of let's just always manage down, because quite honestly, if you don't have that, what you're going to end up with is you're going to have deteriorating infrastructure, one, or you're not going to have appropriate police or fire support. And what goes with not replacing ambulances or fire trucks and keeping them up is response times go down, insurance rates go up at that point for homeowners, and they get the tax either that way or you get the tax this way, whichever you would like to call a tax. The reality is it's just the cost of doing business and living. So anyway, that's my momentary soapbox rant. So if anybody else has any comments, feel free.
You said response rate, and I'm gonna share this story because this happened yesterday. So as I leave church, which is not long after service was over, I'm driving up Davis. I get to Starnes, Rumsfeld. There was a major accident. As we're driving by, my wife says, "That's Ed, one of our church members, Ed Kinder." And the police were there. The fire department was there. They were already cleaning up, and he couldn't have been 3 minutes behind me, which speaks to why this is important to keep we've come to expect it because we live in a great city, but it's not without effort, right? So, by the way, that should be a kudos corner thing at some point, but that's all
Our
I have to say
pastor
about
sent
that.
in a kudos to our police this weekend, didn't he? Yeah. Somebody had a stolen semi in our parking lot with the big gas trailer in the back of it at our church, and called and got it out of the parking lot beforehand. So all the parking spots were opened up. They were waiting for somebody to come probably take it away. So, yes, it was. Anybody else? Comments, thoughts? Nope. Thank you, Trady.
Thank you.
Paulette, anything from you on top of that? Just, you want to say, or are you good?
Well, you kind of stole my thunder.
Okay,
but-
sorry.
But since you asked, I'll also add this. So I don't want to steal the thunder of our bond committee chairs that'll be making their presentation to you next meeting, but you're going to see about 150 million of GO bond projects that they're going to recommend to put out to the voters in November. Along with that, they're going to recommend some additional projects that they think should get done, but through other sources of funding, so either reserves or COs. But of that 150 I mentioned that they're going to recommend for GOs, there's about $86 million in street projects this time that they're recommending in that. And so, so just kind of think about that as it relates to in 2020, it was 49 million, almost 50 million in street projects. And again, the difference between that and what's in our preventive street maintenance is these projects that are put up for the GO bonds are streets that require complete and total reconstruction versus preventive street maintenance is purely that. We're doing either overlays, crack seals, that kind of stuff. So, so that is coupled with this conversation about other long-term debt strategies and the ways that those are funded. So just a little FYI. Oh, and that 150 million would have we estimate about a 2.5 cent impact on the property tax rate. But if that rate is not maintained, obviously that would be a little bit more. So.
Thank you. All right. Next item is the future agenda items. The purpose of this is to allow City Council the opportunity to bring forward a proposal, put an item or issue they wish to discuss in future work session agenda. In accordance with Techno Meetings Act, any discussion shall be limited to a proposal to place the item on the future agenda. The council shall not vote or take any action to these items during this meeting. Council, do you have any proposed future agenda items?
Mayor, I have one. I would like to have us put on the agenda exploring regulations related to the location of data centers in proximity to residential neighborhoods, similar to what the city of Fort Worth has recently proposed, since that is a hot topic.
I hadn't noticed. Is everybody okay with that? Yep. Shaking heads, yes. Shaking heads, yes. Yes. Shaking heads, yes. Okay, that's a unanimous consent. Anything else?
I would like for a future agenda item, and I know y'all both cringe when I start doing this, but discussing how to deal with folks using their driveways and homes, personal homes for used car lots, boat lots, RV lots, etc. It seems to be becoming an issue in a couple of spots. So.
Okay. Do you know how to address that at all? I mean, how you think you'll address it?
Well, what we can do is let you know what our current regulations are and how we can enforce those, and then get input on your thoughts about expanding those. But there are some legal limitations that we have, and so we would kind of explore those once we got your input into it.
Okay.
And I think the code enforcement is the part I'm talking about,
Right. Correct.
and what
Yeah,
we need to adjust.
correct.
Okay. Next item is the city manager's report. Paulette.
Okay, the only thing I have listed here is upcoming town hall meeting, which it's actually not a town hall meeting, but when we were putting the agenda together and having to post it over a week ago, I didn't really have the right wording, so I just used that. But what this is, you know, speaking of data centers, you're going to be seeing an application for a data center in what used to be the Santander business off of Roof Snow. And the company that is going to be putting in that application is a company called Provident. And they are wanting to do a neighborhood meeting kind of in advance of their zoning case public hearing. The application's already in, so that zoning, I think their first zoning public hearing would come in July, and their council hearing would be in August. But so they wanted to do it more of like a neighborhood meeting, but knowing that there's, you know, a large amount of interest in these projects, they are, you know, opening up to invite to the whole city. So they're proposing to have this at Grand Hall on Tuesday, June 23rd at 6:30. And so we're going to be prepared to, you know, just kind of assist with, we know there'll be a large crowd. The city staff will be there as well. We will have an opportunity to present what our current regulations say related to the location of data centers and all of that. But at the meeting, that Provident will present this project specifically and try to address concerns, you know, that we've heard from the public, but also it'll provide an opportunity for the neighborhood folks in particular to ask any questions that they might have and clarify some information before their application goes before the Planning and Zoning Commission and the City Council. And we're going to start putting some information out about the meeting to the public later on this week, but we wanted to make sure that the council was aware. We'll go ahead and also post a notice of possible quorum of the council, anticipating that several of you would want to go. But just for the public's information, the council won't be in a position to discuss it or take any action or anything like that. It's just per the Open Meetings Act, if there's a quorum of a council where they're going to be talking about something that's going to come before them, we have to post that there's a notice of possible quorum. So,
Should be exciting. Anybody? Nope. Okay. I'm ready to read. At this time, the City Council will convene into executive session at 6:41 on June 8th, 2026, to consider matters as authorized by Texas Government Code, Section 551071, consultation with City Attorney to seek about pending and contemplated litigation listed on the posted agenda, Section 551087. Deliberation regarding the economic development negotiations are listed on a posted agenda. Northeast corner of Boulevard 26, Harwood Road, Easy Streets Improvement Zone, and 8021 and 8029 Main Street. And we're out.